the obesity the obesity paradox, when thinner means sicker and heavier means healthier. Part 1, a paradox for the ages. Chapter 1, obesity. What does that really mean? Where it came from. Everyone has a clear picture of what obesity looks like. The word originated in the 17th century from Latin obesus, which literally means having eaten until fat. The Oxford English Dictionary documents its first usage in 1611 by Randall Cotgrave, an English lexicographer who compiled a bilingual French and English dictionary. History. We may think that obesity is a relatively new disease that emerged in the late 20th century, but it dates to the prehistoric era, 25 to 35,000 years ago. The first sculptures represented of the human body depicted obese females. At various times over the centuries, it has stood for wealth or stature, or even luck. In the case of plump Venus figures used in primeval rituals, when it was deemed good and a sign of health, it typically signaled that someone was living a privileged life and didn't go hungry. That person was also likely to be moderately overweight, not morbidly so, like 3% of the US population today. And at other times in history, obesity has been looked upon as a negative attribute, a character flaw and an insult to health. Virtually every culture on the planet has recorded this age-old condition, from the ancient Egyptians to ancient Chinese. Recent history. Over the past 40 years, only in the past 40 years, has obesity become much more prevalent and much more demonized by society. Well over 70% of us are now overweight or obese. Less than 1/3 are considered a healthy weight. But what exactly does that mean? What constitutes a healthy weight? In fact, what constitutes the word weight? Can having a lot of muscle mass and therefore a high body mass index necessarily equate with obesity? The controversy. Contrary to what you might think, the definition of obesity or just being overweight remains controversial. In the US, mortality data provided by Metropolitan Life Insurance Company historically has been used to define obesity. In fact, the entire concept that excess weight can make for an early grave first came from studies done by our country's insurance industry, not the medical community. This definition depends solely on the person's frame. The chart listed the difference between height in inches and weight in pounds. Its purpose was to give ideal body weight values and provide an estimate of body fat composition. But how can we draw the line among small, medium, and large was arbitrary. The original definition was not connected to or based on obesity-related diseases or death. So this is the BMI charts that most doctors' offices and stuff still use today as a guiding factor. So I'm just going to leave this here for a minute and give you time to look at it. BMI is crude. Unfortunately, BMI is a crude way of determining one's risk for obesity-related illnesses and disorders, and it's far from acting like a crystal ball. It cannot predict who will die prematurely and who will live a long life and thrive. Each one of us carries excess weight for a variety of reasons. They can be genetic, behavioral, psychological, or social. And we may be healthy or unhealthy, die prematurely, or live long for an entirely different set of reasons. For one thing, bone is denser than muscle, and twice as dense as fat. So a person with strong bones, good muscle tone, and low fat will have a high BMI. Thus, some athletes can find themselves classified as overweight or obese. Note, despite the flaws inherent in the BMI in terms of health, it's still part of our vocabulary today, and will be part of the conversation going forward. BMI has its imperfections, but it's clear that there are better models for reference points, and it's still used in research circles as a rough guide to an individual's weight status. Obesity epidemic. Today we equate obesity with epidemic, and as such, we define and conceptualize it differently than ever before. Indeed, the obesity epidemic, as we give meaning to it in the 21st century, is not particularly old, although obesity in adults and kids has doubled over the past 40 years. The biggest increase has been since 1980. Prior to this, evidence of the obesity epidemic was hardly identifiable. Obesity rates among children born between 1930s and most of the 1970s remained low and steady. And then the numbers started to go upward rapidly through the 1980s and 1990s. The current obesity epidemic is now considered a public health crisis globally. But this could not have happened prior to the technological advance of the 18th century, which allowed for our food supply to become so grand and reliable. These advances had an immediate and positive effect on our health and longevity. We got thicker and lived longer. But too much of a good thing turned ugly. Since the Second World War, we've experienced an overabundance of too easy to get food. Obesity cause, which begs the question, what is the more powerful factor in causing obesity? More food or less exercise? In this book, it is implied that some evidence has pointed to an increased caloric consumption, especially from sugar, fast food, as a principal cause of obesity. But my colleagues and I have published studies suggesting that the rise in caloric intake has been much less appreciable than most people realize, and that the real culprit is energy expenditure. The number of calories burned daily has declined enormously during the past 5 decades, far outpacing the increase in our daily bread and sugar. Regardless of the cause, the numbers in 2010 ticked even higher as obesity rates reached catastrophic levels at 35.7% of adults and approximately 17% of children and adolescents ages 2 to 9. Study after study highlighted the costs associated with such a statistic. Medical related expenses directly related to obesity are costing Americans $160 billion per year. So this is just some of the diseases that can make the health costs go up related to obesity. So you've got diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, obstructive sleep apnea, high blood cholesterol, and certain types of cancer. This according to the National Health Center statistics. So 28.4% of Americans over 20 years old have a normal weight or are underweight. 31.8% of Americans are over 20 years old are overweight. 32 are over 20 are obese, and 7.7% of Americans are severely obese. Only in the past year has the U.S. come to the categories of obesity as a disease from a medical standpoint, though this was partly a political move. Accurate definition. Where is the line between fat is a good thing and fat is a bad thing? Aside from all the eye-burning numbers, how can we accurately define obesity as a true disease when we know that people can in fact be healthy but overweight, or mildly obese at the same time? Obesity is intriguing in that it's uniquely human or human caused. Have you ever seen an obese wild animal? Obesity doesn't exist in nature because slow, fat creatures are quickly killed by predators, or they die of starvation because they can't catch their prey. We can define obesity however we want, and have been vague at best in finding an accurate definition that takes into consideration all the conflicting data emerging from an intractable medical community. So, the obesity paradox. Overweight and moderately obese patients with certain chronic diseases, from heart disease and arthritis to advanced cancers and even AIDS, often live longer and fare better than normal weight patients with the same ailments. Now, the scientific community has had to re-examine its definition of fat and consider how it could actually be a good thing. The obesity paradox is just too significant to stay buried in the medical literature. Its implications are far too grave for millions of Americans and people, not just Americans, especially those who struggle with their weight. If the science gives us permission to enjoy a few extra pounds and padding for the sake of a better, longer life, shouldn't we be listening? So, the power of the paradox. Prior to entertaining all the possible reasons for the paradox from a scientific perspective, we have to start with the more fundamental questions. Does having a bigger waist circumference increase your odds of living longer and actually surviving a heart attack, cancer, and deadly infections? Can obesity, dare I suggest it, be a blessing to some extent? These were among the questions that started to run in my mind when I first came across this mystery. And as I started to probe deeper, I was pressed to look at more than just the fat component. I had to consider how fitness factored in. The people who fared the worst were low in body fat, but they were low in muscle and cardio fitness too. So it's not only the presence of fat that helps us live long past a horrible diagnosis of a chronic condition, but it's also the existence of what's called cardiorespiratory fitness. There's a great divide between being just fat and being fit and fat, as the obesity paradox has come into clear view over the past decade. So have the facts surrounding the limitations of exercise. We all know exercise is good for us, but how much is too much? No doubt the debate in the fitness community has been equally as heated and continuous as the one around the obesity paradox. All the statistics pointing to the obesity paradox are astounding. Diabetes patients of normal weight are twice as likely to die as those who are overweight or obese. Heavier dialysis patients have lower chance of dying than those of a normal weight. Mild to moderate obesity possesses no additional mortality risks to those already suffering from heart disease. Obesity can help someone with cancer or an infection live longer. A good paradox in science is a good problem to have if you are looking for the truth. It opens the door to new information. What it means to be healthy. So if you were to ask me what it means to be healthy, my response would be the following. Regardless of your weight and BMI, if you're metabolically sound and cardiovascular fit, you are healthy. What I mean by metabolically sound is you don't have any serious metabolic conditions like uncontrollable type 2 diabetes or lipid disorders such as dangerously high cholesterol. This also means that you can be overweight or obese by modern standards, but still healthy by many other measures. And the higher your fitness level, the better. I will even go as far to suggest that you can be overweight or mildly obese with some metabolic disorders as a result and still be deemed healthy. You can be healthier than someone with a lower BMI. Don't get the wrong idea when I stress the importance of fitness. You don't need to be a gym rat to be considered fit. Obesity stigma. Although being thin and unfit is worse than being overweight from a health standpoint, we often idolize, covet, and praise the former, while stigmatizing the latter. A professor at UCLA makes some convincing statements suggesting that public discussion of the obesity crisis often does more harm than good, leading to bullying, weight bias discrimination, and misdiagnosis. We live in a society that pretty much leads us to believe that we are thinner than we are, the healthier we are, and that a diagnosis of obesity is the same as a big fat nail in our coffin. But this perspective is flawed on two counts. First, it's based on an ill-defined parameters in which fat and obesity are misunderstood. And second, it leads to the endorsement of lifestyle habits that jeopardize our health and longevity. If I had to point to one big question raised by the volume of data that we've gathered, it would be this. Are we so obsessed with the obesity epidemic that we're going to extremes in teaching the wrong habits for healthy living? The answer is a resounding yes. The obesity paradox may be our generation's window for looking into the body and coming to an exceeding better understanding of it.